She trusted her cousin like a brother. The unthinkable crime that destroyed a family. Maple Creek, Ohio, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where front porch swings swayed in the summer breeze, and where the annual county fair was the highlight of the year. It was a place of quiet routines and close-knit families, a place where, on the surface, life seemed idyllic and uncomplicated. But for 11-year-old Rashida Jones, Maple Creek was a place of precarious refuge, a temporary haven in a life marked by loss and uncertainty. Rashida had come to live with her uncle's family 3 years earlier, after a tragic car accident had claimed the lives of both her parents. She remembered little of her life before the accident, only fragments of memories: her mother's gentle smile, her father's booming laughter, the warmth of their small apartment in the city. Now, she lived in a sprawling, two-story house on the outskirts of town, a house filled with unfamiliar faces and unspoken tensions. Her uncle David was a kind but distant man, consumed by his work as a regional manager for a government agency. He was often away on business trips, leaving Rashida in the care of her aunt, Carol, and her 3 cousins. Carol was a harried, perpetually stressed woman, struggling to manage a large household on a tight budget. She wasn't unkind to Rashida, but she lacked the warmth and affection that Rashida craved. The 3 cousins were a mixed bag. The oldest, 16-year-old Maria, was preoccupied with boys and social media, largely ignoring Rashida. 12-year-old John was a boisterous, energetic boy, more interested in sports than in his quiet, bookish cousin. And then there was Sabir, the oldest, at 22. Sabir was the black sheep of the family, a constant source of worry and frustration for his parents. He had dropped out of community college, drifted between dead-end jobs, and spent most of his time hanging out with a group of friends who were known for their troublemaking. He was handsome, with a charming smile that could disarm even the most skeptical observer, but there was a recklessness in his eyes, a simmering anger that hinted at a darker side. Rashida, despite her difficult circumstances, was a remarkably resilient child. She was bright and inquisitive, with a natural curiosity about the world. She excelled in school, finding solace in her studies, immersing herself in books and learning. Her teachers admired her dedication, her quiet determination, and her unwavering kindness. They knew about her past, about the loss of her parents, and they went out of their way to offer her extra support and encouragement. She tried to be helpful around the house, assisting Carol with chores, trying to earn her place in this unfamiliar family. She longed for a sense of belonging, for a feeling of security and stability, but she always felt like an outsider, a guest in someone else's home. Her relationship with Sabir was complex. He was, for the most part, indifferent to her, treating her with a careless disregard that bordered on neglect. But occasionally, he would show a flicker of kindness, a brief moment of attention that would leave Rashida feeling confused and hopeful. He would tease her, sometimes playfully, sometimes cruelly, and she never quite knew how to respond. She trusted him, because he was family, but there was also something about him that made her uneasy, a sense of unease she couldn't quite articulate. It was a precarious balance, a fragile sense of belonging that could be shattered at any moment. The Thompson household was a place of unspoken tensions and simmering resentments. David's frequent absences created a void, a lack of stability that permeated every aspect of their lives. Carol, overwhelmed by the responsibilities of managing a large family and a tight budget, often seemed on the verge of collapse. She was constantly stressed, constantly worried, and her anxiety manifested as a sharp tongue and a critical eye. Rashida, with her quiet demeanor and her eagerness to please, often became the target of Carol's frustrations. Carol would find fault with her chores, criticize her appearance, and compare her unfavorably to Maria, her own daughter. Rashida learned to absorb the criticism, to retreat into herself, to find solace in her books and her studies. Maria, caught up in the throes of adolescence, was largely indifferent to Rashida's presence. She saw her younger cousin as a nuisance, an unwelcome addition to the family. She would often exclude Rashida from her activities, making her feel like an outsider in her own home. John, though more playful and less overtly hostile, was often too caught up in his own world to offer Rashida much companionship. Sabir was the most unpredictable element in the family dynamic. He was a chameleon, shifting between charm and aggression, between indifference and a strange and settling attentiveness. He spent most of his time out of the house, his whereabouts and activities a constant source of worry for his parents. When he was home, he was often disruptive, blasting loud music, arguing with his mother, and generally creating an atmosphere of chaos. He had a quick temper, and his anger could flare up unexpectedly, leaving everyone in the house walking on eggshells. David, when he was home, tried to discipline Sabir, but his efforts were largely ineffective. He would lecture him, threaten him, even occasionally resort to physical force, but Sabir seemed immune to his father's authority. He would simply shrug off the punishments, retreating into a sullen silence or disappearing for days at a time. Carol, caught between her husband's anger and her son's defiance, often seemed helpless and defeated. She would plead with Sabir to change his ways, to get a job, to make something of his life. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Rashida observed these interactions with a growing sense of unease. She saw the pain in her aunt's eyes, the frustration in her uncle's voice, the simmering resentment that festered beneath the surface of their family life. She longed to help, to somehow ease their burdens, but she felt powerless to do so. She also noticed a disturbing pattern in Sabir's behavior. He seemed to be increasingly drawn to her, in a way that made her uncomfortable. He would stare at her, his eyes lingering on her body, his gaze making her skin crawl. He would make suggestive comments, veiled innuendos that she didn't fully understand but that left her feeling deeply uneasy. He started to invade her personal space, touching her arm, her hair, her shoulder, in ways that felt inappropriate, violating. She would try to pull away, to avoid him, but he would just laugh, dismissing her discomfort as childishness. Rashida didn't know how to interpret his behavior. She had always trusted him, as a member of her family, as someone who was supposed to protect her. But now, she felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that something was terribly wrong. She tried to tell herself that she was imagining things, that he was just being playful, but the unease persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. She began to feel like a prisoner in her own home, trapped in a web of unspoken anxieties and growing fears. She yearned for her parents, for the safety and security of her former life, a life that now seemed like a distant, fading dream. The annual family trip to visit Rashida's grandmother, a 2-hour drive to a small, rural town, was usually a source of excitement. It was a chance to escape the confines of Maple Creek, to spend time with extended family, to enjoy the simple pleasures of country life. But this year, a sense of dread hung over Rashida, a premonition of something terrible about to happen. The trip was planned for a long weekend in early June. David, as usual, was away on business, leaving Carol to manage the packing and the preparations. Maria was excited about seeing her cousins, while John was looking forward to exploring the woods and fields surrounding his grandmother's house. Sabir, however, was unusually sullen and withdrawn. He had initially refused to go, claiming he had better things to do, but Carol, after a heated argument, had insisted that he accompany them, threatening to cut off his allowance if he disobeyed. The day before the trip, Carol received a phone call. It was her sister, informing her that their mother had taken a fall and was in the hospital. Carol, understandably distraught, decided to leave immediately, taking Maria and John with her. She asked Sabir to stay behind and look after Rashida, promising to return as soon as possible. Rashida felt a surge of panic when she heard the news. The thought of being left alone with Sabir filled her with a deep, visceral fear. She tried to protest, to convince her aunt to take her with them, but Carol was too preoccupied with her mother's condition to listen. "It'll be fine, Rashida," she said, her voice distracted. "Sabir will take care of you. Just stay home. Don't answer the door to strangers, and I'll be back as soon as I can." And with that, she was gone, leaving Rashida alone in the house with the one person she feared most. The first few hours were uneventful. Sabir, true to form, ignored Rashida, spending most of his time in his room, listening to music and texting his friends. Rashida stayed in her room, reading, trying to distract herself from the growing sense of unease. As evening approached, however, Sabir's behavior changed. He became more attentive, more solicitous. He offered to make her dinner, a gesture that was so out of character that it immediately raised Rashida's suspicions. He made her a simple meal of pasta and sauce, and brought her a glass of milk. "Here," he said, his voice unusually gentle. "Drink this. It'll help you sleep." Rashida hesitated. There was something about his demeanor, about the way he was looking at her, that made her skin crawl. But she didn't want to offend him, didn't want to provoke his anger. She took a small sip of the milk, pretending to drink more. It tasted strange, slightly bitter. She felt a wave of nausea, a growing dizziness. She set the glass down, her hand trembling. I don't feel so good," she said, her voice slurred. Sabir smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a chill down her spine. "Don't worry," he said. "Just lie down. You'll feel better soon." He helped her to his room, his touch lingering on her arm, her back. She felt a growing sense of panic, a desperate urge to escape, but her body felt heavy, her limbs unresponsive. He laid her down on his bed, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that terrified her. She tried to speak, to protest, but her voice was gone, her throat constricted by fear. The last thing she remembered was Sabir's face looming over her, his smile twisting into something sinister, something monstrous. Then, darkness enveloped her, a deep, drug-induced sleep that blotted out the horror of what was about to happen. The act itself was a violation, a betrayal of trust, a shattering of innocence that would forever alter the course of Rashida's life. The days and weeks that followed the assault were a strange, unsettling blur for Rashida. She woke up the next morning in her own bed, feeling groggy and disoriented. She had a vague, disturbing memory of being in Sabir's room, of feeling helpless and afraid, but she couldn't grasp the full reality of what had happened. She attributed her confusion and fatigue to the strange-tasting milk, dismissing the unsettling memory as a bad dream. Sabir, for his part, acted as if nothing had happened. He was his usual, sullen self, avoiding eye contact with Rashida but otherwise showing no signs of guilt or remorse. He even casually mentioned that she had fallen asleep while watching TV in his room, and that he had carried her back to her bed. Rashida, still reeling from the lingering effects of the sleeping pills and struggling to piece together the fragmented memories of the night before, accepted his explanation, albeit with a lingering sense of unease. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that nothing terrible had happened, that her trust in her cousin had not been violated. Her aunt and cousins returned a few days later, their grandmother's condition stabilized. Life in the Thompson household returned to its usual chaotic rhythm, with David's frequent absences, Carol's constant stress, and Sabir's disruptive behavior. Rashida tried to push the unsettling memories to the back of her mind, focusing on her schoolwork, her books, and her quiet routines. She excelled in her classes, earning praise from her teachers and maintaining her position as one of the top students in her grade. She found solace in learning, in the structured world of academics, a world where she felt a sense of control and accomplishment. But beneath the surface, subtle changes were taking place. She became more withdrawn, more introverted, even more so than before. She avoided physical contact with anyone, flinching at even the slightest touch. She had trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares she couldn't fully remember, waking up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding with a nameless fear. She also started to experience physical symptoms that she couldn't explain. She felt nauseous, especially in the mornings. She had headaches, fatigue, and a strange, persistent ache in her lower abdomen. She attributed these symptoms to stress, to the lingering effects of the sleeping pills, to anything but the unthinkable truth. She confided in no one. The shame, the fear, the lingering doubt kept her silent. She couldn't bring herself to tell her aunt, fearing her reaction, fearing that she would be blamed, that she would be disbelieved. She couldn't tell her friends, fearing their judgment, their whispers, their pity. She carried the burden alone, a secret growing inside her, both literally and figuratively. The weight of that secret, the denial, the repression, began to take its toll, manifesting in both physical and emotional ways. She became increasingly anxious, prone to sudden bursts of tears, and easily startled by loud noises or sudden movements. She started to avoid Sabir completely, crossing the street when she saw him approaching, hiding in her room when he was home. He, in turn, seemed to ignore her, treating her with a cold indifference that was almost more disturbing than his previous unsettling attention. The unknowing days stretched on, weeks turning into months. Rashida lived in a state of suspended reality, a world where the truth was buried beneath layers of denial, fear, and a desperate longing for everything to return to normal. But normal, as she had known it, was gone forever. The seed of betrayal had been planted, and it was growing, slowly but inexorably, changing her life in ways she could not yet comprehend. The ticking clock of her body was counting down to a revelation that would shatter her world. The first unmistakable sign came during a school gym class. Rashida, participating in a volleyball game, felt a sudden, sharp pain in her abdomen. She doubled over, clutching her stomach, her face pale with shock and fear. The gym teacher, Mrs. Evans, rushed to her side, her expression filled with concern. "Rashida, what's wrong? Are you okay, Mrs. Evans asked, kneeling beside her. Rashida couldn't speak, couldn't explain the searing pain that was radiating through her body. She felt a warm, wet sensation between her legs, and when she looked down, she saw blood staining her shorts. Panic surged through her. She had never experienced anything like this before. Her periods had always been regular, predictable, and relatively painless. This was different. This was terrifying. Mrs. Evans, seeing the blood and the fear in Rashida's eyes, immediately understood the situation. She helped Rashida to the nurse's office, her arm around her, offering words of comfort and reassurance. The school nurse, a kind and experienced woman named Mrs. Peterson, examined Rashida gently. She asked a series of questions, her voice calm and professional, trying to ascertain the cause of the bleeding. "Rashida, honey, when was your last period, Mrs. Peterson asked. Rashida, her mind racing, tried to remember. It had been months, she realized, but she had been so preoccupied with other things, so stressed and anxious, that she hadn't even noticed. She had attributed the missed periods to stress, to the changes in her life, to anything but the truth. Mrs. Peterson's expression grew serious. "Rashida," she said gently, "I think you might be pregnant." The words hit Rashida like a physical blow. She stared at the nurse, her mind reeling, her body trembling. Pregnant? It was impossible. It couldn't be true. But deep down, a terrifying certainty began to dawn. The nausea, the fatigue, the missed periods, the strange ache in her abdomen. It all added up. The unthinkable, the impossible, was happening. Mrs. Peterson, seeing the shock and disbelief on Rashida's face, explained that she needed to go to the hospital for further tests, to confirm the pregnancy and determine how far along she was. She called Carol, Rashida's aunt, explaining the situation in carefully chosen words, emphasizing the need for immediate medical attention. Carol arrived at the school, her face a mask of confusion and growing anxiety. She listened to the nurse's explanation, her eyes darting nervously to Rashida, who sat silently, her body numb with shock. The drive to the hospital was a blur of fear and denial. Carol kept asking questions, her voice sharp with panic, but Rashida couldn't answer. She couldn't speak, couldn't think. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, a waking dream from which she couldn't escape. At the hospital, a series of tests confirmed the nurse's suspicions. Rashida was indeed pregnant, and not just a few weeks, but 5 months along. The doctor, a kind, elderly woman named Dr. Ramirez, explained the situation to Carol and Rashida, her voice filled with compassion and concern. "The pregnancy is quite advanced," Dr. Ramirez said. "At this stage, termination is not an option. Rashida will have to carry the baby to term." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Carol stared at Rashida, her face a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. Rashida, still reeling from the news, could only stare back, her eyes filled with a profound, heartbreaking sense of confusion and fear. She had no memory of how this could have happened, no understanding of the events that had led to this impossible situation. Her life, already fragile and uncertain, had just been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The truth, a terrifying and incomprehensible truth, was now undeniable. The ride home from the hospital was a silent, suffocating ordeal. Carol, her face a mask of fury and shame, refused to look at Rashida. The silence was broken only by the occasional, choked sob that escaped Rashida's lips. As soon as they entered the house, Carol exploded. "How could you let this happen?" she screamed, her voice shaking with rage. How could you be so stupid, so irresponsible? Rashida, still reeling from the shock of the diagnosis, could only stare at her end, her mind blank, her body numb. She couldn't explain, couldn't defend herself, because she didn't understand it herself. I don't know, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I don't remember. I don't know how. Carol grabbed Rashida by the shoulders, her fingers digging into her flesh. Don't lie to me, she shrieked. You know how this happened. You've been sneaking around, haven't you? With some boy from school. Rashida shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, Aunt Carol, I swear. I don't know. I would never. The commotion brought Maria and John running into the room. They stared at their mother and cousin, their faces filled with confusion and fear. What's going on? Maria asked, her voice hesitant. Your cousin, Carol spat, her voice filled with disgust, is pregnant. She's ruined our family. She's brought shame upon us all. Maria and John gasped, their eyes widening in disbelief. They looked at Rashida, their expressions a mixture of shock and pity. David, who had been called home from work, arrived in the midst of the chaos. He took one look at the scene, Carol's furious face, Rashida's tear-streaked cheeks, the terrified expressions of the other children, and his own face hardened with anger. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, his voice booming through the house. Carol explained, her voice shrill and accusatory, pointing at Rashida as if she were a criminal. David listened, his anger growing with each word. Who is the father? He demanded, his eyes fixed on Rashida. Tell me, who did this to you? Rashida, overwhelmed by the accusations, the fear, the sheer impossibility of the situation, broke down completely. She sobbed uncontrollably, able to speak, and able to defend herself. Then, in a moment of clarity, amidst the swirling chaos of her emotions, a flicker of memory surfaced. The night of the family trip, the strange-tasting milk, Sabir's unsettling smile, the vague, disturbing images that she had dismissed as a bad dream. Sabir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was Sabir. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at her, their faces a mixture of disbelief and horror. David turned to Sabir, who had been standing silently in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. Is this true? He demanded, his voice low and threatening. Sabir, his usual arrogance gone, looked pale and shaken. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He glanced at his mother, his siblings, his eyes pleading for help, for denial. But Carol, her initial fury now replaced by a growing sense of dread, could only stare at her son, her face a mask of horror. She, too, had begun to piece together the timeline, the events of that fateful night. Sabir, David repeated, his voice rising in anger. Answer me. Did you do this to your cousin? Sabir, cornered and exposed, initially tried to deny it. He stammered, he protested, he claimed Rashida was lying, that she was confused, that she was trying to frame him. But his denials were weak, unconvincing. The evidence, though circumstantial, was mounting against him. The fact that Rashida had no memory of the event, the timing of the pregnancy, the subtle changes in his behavior over the past few months, it all pointed to his guilt. Finally, under the relentless pressure of his father's questioning, under the weight of his mother's horrified gaze, Sabir's defenses crumbled. He broke down sobbing and confessed. He admitted to drugging Rashida, to taking advantage of her vulnerability, to committing the unspeakable act that had shattered their family. He begged for forgiveness, claiming he hadn't meant to hurt her, that he had been under the influence of drugs, that he didn't know what had come over him. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The damage was done. The truth, however horrific, had been revealed. And the Thompson family, already fractured and fragile, was now irrevocably broken. The aftermath of Sabir's confession was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Horror, disbelief, shame, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal consumed the Thompson family. David, his rage fueled by a sense of violated honor and paternal failure, wanted to throw Sabir out of the house, to disown him completely. Carol, torn between her love for her son and the monstrous act he had committed, pleaded for understanding, for leniency. Maria and John, struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had happened, retreated into themselves, their innocence shattered, their family dynamics irrevocably altered. Rashida, the victim, the silent center of the storm, felt a strange mixture of relief and despair. The truth was out, but the knowledge brought no peace, no solace. It only confirmed the terrifying reality of her situation, the irreversible consequences of Sabir's actions. After a series of heated arguments, tearful pleas, and agonizing soul-searching, the family reached a difficult, precarious decision. They would not report Sabir to the police. They would keep the matter within the family, shielding themselves from the public shame and the potential legal ramifications. Their decision was driven by a complex mix of factors. They feared the judgment of their community, the stigma that would be attached to their family, the potential for media scrutiny. They also, despite everything, still felt a sense of loyalty to Sabir, a misguided desire to protect him from the consequences of his actions. And perhaps most importantly, they feared the impact on Rashida, the trauma of a public trial, the potential for further victimization. They consulted with Dr. Ramirez, the physician who had diagnosed Rashida's pregnancy. They explained the situation, omitting the identity of the perpetrator, focusing instead on Rashida's age and her lack of understanding. They asked about the possibility of an abortion, desperate for a way to erase the evidence of Sabir's crime. Dr. Ramirez, bound by her ethical obligations and her concern for Rashida's well-being, informed them that it was too late. The pregnancy was too far advanced, the risks to Rashida's health too great. She would have to carry the baby to term. This news was a devastating blow to the family. It sealed their fate, forcing them to confront the reality of Rashida's situation and the irreversible consequences of Sabir's actions. From that moment on, a heavy silence descended upon the Thompson household. The secret of Rashida's pregnancy and the identity of the father became a carefully guarded burden, a weight that each member of the family carried in their own way. Carol, driven by a mixture of guilt, shame, and a desperate need to control the situation, took charge of Rashida's care. She monitored her diet, restricted her activities, and shielded her from the outside world. She became Rashida's jailer, her protector, and her silent accuser, all rolled into one. Rashida, trapped in this suffocating environment, felt increasingly isolated and alone. She was a prisoner in her own home, her body a constant reminder of the betrayal she had suffered, her future stolen from her. She longed to escape, to run away, but she had nowhere to go. She was dependent on her family, the very people who had both harmed her and were now attempting to protect her, a paradox that left her feeling trapped and powerless. The weight of their silence, the burden of their secret, was slowly crushing her spirit. Despite the family's desperate attempts to keep Rashida's pregnancy a secret, the truth, like a relentless tide, began to erode their carefully constructed facade. As Rashida's body changed, her condition became increasingly difficult to conceal. The whispers and rumors, initially confined to the family, began to spread, seeping into the wider community. At school, Rashida's classmates noticed her growing belly, her increasingly withdrawn demeanor. They whispered behind her back, pointed fingers, and made cruel jokes. The teachers, initially sympathetic and supportive, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Rashida tried to ignore the whispers, to focus on her studies, to pretend that everything was normal. But the constant scrutiny, the judgmental stares, the unspoken accusations were taking their toll. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. One day, during a particularly grueling gym class, Rashida began to experience severe abdominal cramps. She doubled over in pain, her face contorted with agony. Mrs. Evans, the gym teacher, rushed to her side, her expression filled with alarm. "Rashida, what's wrong? Are you okay, Mrs. Evans asked, her voice urgent. Rashida couldn't answer. The pain was too intense, too overwhelming. She felt a sudden gush of fluid between her legs, and then a terrifying wave of contractions. She was going into labor. Mrs. Evans, realizing the gravity of the situation, immediately called for an ambulance. The other students, initially shocked into silence, began to murmur and speculate. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The truth, long suppressed, was about to explode into the open. As Rashida was being carried out of the gym on a stretcher, she lost consciousness. She didn't see the horrified faces of her classmates, the shocked expressions of her teachers. She didn't hear the sirens wailing, the frantic calls to the hospital. She woke up in a sterile, white room, her body aching, her mind reeling. A nurse was standing beside her, her expression a mixture of sympathy and professional concern. "Rashida, honey," the nurse said gently, "you've had a baby." "A little boy." The words barely registered. Rashida stared at the nurse, her mind blank, her body numb. A baby. She had given birth. Then, the memories flooded back. The pain, the fear, the chaos of the gym class, the horrified faces of her classmates. The secret, so carefully guarded, was out. The nurse brought her the baby, a tiny, wrinkled creature with a shock of dark hair. Rashida looked at him, her heart filled with a confusing mix of emotions: love, fear, sadness, and a profound sense of unreality. He was beautiful, innocent, and yet he was a living reminder of the trauma she had endured, the secret she had carried for so long. The news of Rashida's premature delivery at school spread like wildfire through Maple Creek. Within hours, the story was all over social media, fueled by rumors, speculation, and inevitable whispers that had been circulating for months. The Thompson family's carefully constructed facade of normalcy crumbled, exposing the dark secret they had tried so desperately to conceal. Carol and David arrived at the hospital, their faces etched with a mixture of fear, shame, and a desperate hope that somehow they could still contain the damage. They were met not only by doctors and nurses, but also by police officers and social workers. The authorities had been notified, and an investigation was already underway. The school, facing a barrage of questions from parents, students, and the media, issued a statement expressing their shock and concern, promising to cooperate fully with the authorities. Mr. Harrison, the principal, who had previously dismissed concerns about Rashida, now found himself under intense scrutiny, his actions or inactions being questioned by everyone. The local newspaper ran a front-page story, detailing the events at the school and the subsequent investigation. The story quickly went viral, attracting national attention, turning the quiet town of Maple Creek into the epicenter of a media storm. Reporters descended on the town, seeking interviews with Rashida, her family, and anyone who knew them. The Thompson house was besieged by cameras and microphones, their every move scrutinized, their privacy invaded. The family, already reeling from the emotional fallout of Sabir's confession and Rashida's premature delivery, now found themselves thrust into the harsh glare of the public eye. The online reaction was swift and brutal. Social media platforms were flooded with comments, opinions, and judgments. Some expressed sympathy for Rashida, offering messages of support and condemning Sabir's actions. Others were less kind, blaming Rashida, questioning her character, and spreading vicious rumors about her and her family. The weight of public opinion, the relentless scrutiny, the sheer volume of the online commentary was overwhelming. The Thompsons felt like they were drowning in a sea of judgment, their lives dissected and analyzed by strangers who knew nothing of their pain, their struggles, their complex reality. For Rashida, the public revelation was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was a relief to have the secret out in the open, to no longer have to carry the burden of silence. But on the other hand, it was a terrifying ordeal, exposing her to the judgment, the criticism, and the potential for further victimization. She felt vulnerable, exposed, and utterly alone. The world, once a place of quiet routines and familiar faces, had become a hostile and unpredictable landscape. The carefully guarded secret, meant to protect the family, had exploded, leaving them all exposed and vulnerable to the harsh judgment of the outside world. The days and weeks following the public revelation were a blur of legal proceedings, social services interventions, and relentless media scrutiny. Child Protective Services (CPS) launched an investigation, assessing the safety and well-being of Rashida and her newborn son, as well as her younger cousins, Maria and John. The police investigation into Sabir intensified. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, facing the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence. His initial denials crumbled under the weight of the evidence, and he eventually confessed, his bravado replaced by a mixture of shame and self-pity. The legal process was slow and agonizing, forcing Rashida to relive the trauma repeatedly, to recount the details of the assault in excruciating detail, to face the scrutiny of lawyers, judges, and the ever-present media. Mrs. Davison, along with a court-appointed advocate, stood by Rashida's side, offering support and guidance, helping her navigate the complex legal system. The Thompson family, fractured and reeling, struggled to cope with the fallout. David, consumed by guilt and shame, retreated into himself, his anger replaced by a profound sense of failure. He had failed to protect his niece, failed to control his son, failed to maintain the facade of a respectable family. Carol, initially focused on protecting her son and preserving the family's reputation, slowly began to realize the enormity of Sabir's crime and the devastating impact it had on Rashida. She grappled with feelings of guilt, shame, and a growing sense of responsibility for her role in enabling the abuse through her negligence and her focus on appearances. Maria and John, caught in the crossfire, struggled to make sense of the chaos and betrayal that had shattered their family. They were ostracized at school, bullied and ridiculed by their peers. They felt a mixture of anger towards Sabir, sympathy for Rashida, and confusion about their own place in the fractured family dynamic. The community of Maple Creek was divided. Some rallied around Rashida, offering support and condemning Sabir's actions. Others, clinging to their traditional values and their ingrained biases, whispered behind their hands, questioning Rashida's character, blaming her for the family's downfall. The media coverage, initially sensationalistic and intrusive, gradually shifted in tone. As Rashida's story unfolded, as her strength and resilience became apparent, some reporters began to portray her with more empathy and understanding. They highlighted the systemic failures that had allowed the abuse to occur, the importance of believing victims, and the need for greater awareness and prevention of child sexual assault. Rashida, despite the immense pressure and the emotional toll, found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She cooperated fully with the authorities, testified against Sabir, and spoke out publicly about her experience. Determined to use her voice to raise awareness and prevent others from suffering the same fate, she found solace in her son, whom she named Daniel, meaning God is my judge, a testament to her enduring faith and her belief that justice would ultimately prevail. She poured all her love and energy into caring for him, finding purpose and meaning in motherhood, a role that had been thrust upon her under horrific circumstances but that she now embraced with fierce determination. She also began to connect with other survivors of abuse, finding strength and solidarity in shared experiences. She realized that she was not alone, that her story was part of a larger narrative of silence, shame, and the struggle for justice. And she vowed to use her voice, her experience, to help break that silence, to empower other victims, and to create a world where children could grow up safe, protected, and free from the fear of abuse. Sabir's trial was a highly publicized event, drawing national attention to the small town of Maple Creek. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and advocates for both sides. The atmosphere was tense, emotionally charged, and the weight of public opinion hung heavy in the air. Rashida, despite her fear and anxiety, testified with courage and dignity. She recounted the events of that fateful night, her voice trembling but clear, her eyes fixed on Sabir, who sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and drawn. She described the manipulation, the drugging, the violation, and the profound sense of betrayal she had felt. Her testimony was powerful and moving, leaving many in the courtroom in tears. It was a testament to her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering commitment to seeking justice. Sabir's defense attorney attempted to discredit Rashida, questioning her character, suggesting that she had consented to the encounter, portraying her as a troubled and promiscuous teenager. But Rashida held her ground, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to be silenced. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including Sabir's confession, the DNA evidence confirming his paternity, and the testimony of Mrs. Davison and Dr. Carter, who spoke about Rashida's trauma and her unwavering truthfulness. The jury, after deliberating for several hours, returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Sabir was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a sentence that brought a sense of closure, but not necessarily peace, to Rashida and her family. The aftermath of the trial was a time of slow, painful healing. Rashida continued to work with Dr. Carter, processing her trauma, learning to cope with the lasting emotional scars. She found solace in her son, Daniel, who was growing into a bright, curious, and loving child. She also found support in a community of survivors, women, and girls who had endured similar experiences and who understood the complexities of her journey. She participated in support groups, shared her story at public events, and became an advocate for child protection and sexual assault awareness. The Thompson family, shattered by the events of the past year, began the long and difficult process of rebuilding their lives. David and Carol, forced to confront their own failures and complicity, sought counseling, individually and as a couple. They made a conscious effort to reconnect with their daughters, Maria and John, offering them the support and understanding they needed to heal. The relationship between Rashida and her aunt and uncle remained complex, strained by the weight of the past. But over time, a fragile truce emerged, a shared commitment to creating a safe and supportive environment for Daniel. They could never fully erase the pain, the betrayal, the trauma, but they could learn to live with it, to move forward, to build a new future based on honesty, respect, and a shared love for the child who had, in a strange and unexpected way, brought them together. Rashida, years later, would reflect on her journey, on the darkness she had endured, and the light she had found. She had lost her innocence, her childhood, her sense of safety and security. But she had also found her voice, her strength, her purpose. She had become a survivor, a warrior, a beacon of hope for others. Her story, though filled with pain and heartbreak, was ultimately a story of resilience, of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the most unimaginable trauma. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can be found, healing is possible, and justice, though often delayed, can ultimately prevail. And most importantly, it was a testament to the power of love, the love of a mother for her child, the love of a community for its own, and the love that can blossom even in the most shattered of families.